The night Amara fled the palace, she left behind everything: her title, her warriors, and the only life she had ever known. For the first time, she was not a princess, not a warrior, not the heir to a throne. She was simply a woman on the run. The forest swallowed her whole, its thick trees and endless darkness stretching out before her like a prison with no walls. She had left behind bloodshed, yet she found no peace. She was alone, surviving in the wild. Days turned into weeks as she wandered, searching for food, water, and shelter. She had been trained for war, but she had never been trained to live without an army, without servants, without a home. Hunger clawed at her stomach like a beast. She learned to catch small animals, to drink from muddy rivers, to tear apart wild fruits with trembling fingers. The once proud princess of Uzedo was now nothing more than a shadow moving between trees, her royal robes torn and stained with dirt. At night, she dreamed of fire. She saw the burning city, her father's disappointed eyes, the faces of the men she had fought, the women she had sworn to protect. And when she woke, the dreams did not fade, they lingered like ghosts, haunting her with every step. The king's death. Far away, back in the kingdom, King Obani was dying. He lay in his grand chamber, his once mighty body reduced to nothing but bones and fading breath. The palace, once filled with his booming voice, was silent. Even the chiefs and elders, who had always feared him, now stood in uneasy silence around his bed. But there was one thing he needed before he left this world. Find her, he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. Bring Amara to me. The chiefs exchanged uneasy glances. They had no intention of bringing back the woman they had driven away. A woman ruler was a curse in their eyes. But one man listened. Ikin, the king's most trusted warrior. As the others left the chamber, Ikin knelt beside his dying king. He had known Amara since childhood. He had watched her fight, bleed, and suffer under her father's brutal training. He had always wondered if she could ever be something more than the weapon the king had made her. Now, he had no choice but to find out. The king's last words. That night, when the palace was quiet, the king called for Ikin one last time. His voice was weaker now, his breath slow and labored. His death was close. Tell her, he coughed, blood staining his lips. Tell her, love is weakness, to be feared. She must never love. Ikin's jaw tightened. My king, what if she chooses a different path? The king's fading eyes met his. Then she will die. With those final words, King Opanu, the ruler of Uzedo, the man who had shaped Amara into a warrior, took his last breath. The broken heir. Amara did not know that her father was dead. She did not know that war had erupted in her absence, that her people were suffering, that her throne was being torn apart by greed and ambition. She only knew the forest, the hunger, the endless wandering. One night, as she sat by a dying fire, she stared at her own reflection in a pool of water. The woman who looked back at her was unrecognizable, thin, bruised, exhausted. For the first time in her life, she felt lost. Was this who she was meant to be? A warrior with no war, a queen with no kingdom. As the fire flickered and the shadows stretched around her, Amara closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. As the chiefs and elders plotted to divide the kingdom rather than allow Amara to rule, warriors clashed in the streets. Fires burned in the villages. Families were torn apart. But even as Amara's loyalists fought against the rebellion, they needed their queen. Ikin rode out alone, following whispers of her last known whereabouts. He had seen her train, fight, and led armies. But this was different. Would she even want to return? Days turned into weeks as he followed her trail. She had been careful, never staying in one place for too long, covering her tracks. But Ikin was patient. He knew her well enough to predict her movements. And at last, deep in the forests beyond Uzeto, he found her. The exiled queen. Amara was sitting by a small fire in a hidden cave, sharpening a blade. Her once ornate robes were replaced by rough hunting clothes. She looked thinner, her face shadowed by exhaustion. But her eyes burned with the same fire Ikin had always known. She didn't look up as he approached. How long did it take you? She asked. Ikin smirked. Longer than I expected. She finally met his gaze, and for a moment, he saw something unfamiliar: hesitation. Why are you here, Ikin? He sat across from her. Your father sent me. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Of course, he did. He's dead, Amara. Silence. The fire crackled between them. He wanted you to know one thing before he died. Ikin continued. He said, love is weakness. And if you want to rule, you must never love. Amara's grip tightened around the blade. Her father's final lesson. The same lesson he had drilled into her since childhood. She should have felt nothing. But deep down, something inside her cracked. Ikin watched her carefully. The kingdom is at war. The elders would rather burn you Zedo to the ground than see you rule. But your warriors are still loyal. They need you. Amara stared into the fire. If she returned, she would have to fight for her throne. She would have to become more ruthless than ever before, and she would have to bury the part of herself that longed for something more than war. After a long pause, she rose to her feet. Take me home, Ikin. And with that, the exiled queen began her journey back to reclaim her throne. Amara lowered her makeshift spear and stared into the darkness of the forest. She had spent so much time running, hiding, hating. Now, she had been given exactly what she once wanted. But the girl who left Uzedo was not the same woman standing here. She looked at Ikin, searching for deceit, but found none. He had been sent to bring her back, yet there was something else in his eyes. A quiet understanding. A fear of what she would become if she accepted this throne. She turned away from him, staring into the fire. If I go back, she murmured, I will not rule with kindness. Ikin was silent for a long time before he spoke. Then rule with strength. Amara closed her eyes. Strength. It was all she had ever known, and it was all she had left. She would return, but not as the princess who had fled. She would return as a queen. The journey back to Uzedo was long, but for Amara, it felt like stepping into a past she had tried to bury. The closer they got, the more memories resurfaced: the brutal training under her father, the palace walls that had once felt like a prison, the faces of men who had sworn she would never rule, and she was going back to claim what was hers. As she rode into the city, flanked by Ikin and a battalion of warriors, the streets were eerily silent. People peered out from their homes, whispering as they saw her, a woman dressed in battle armor, her skin roughened by exile, her expression unreadable. At the gates of the palace, the warriors who had fought for her stood in formation. Some bowed their heads in respect. Others looked at her with uncertainty. One of the elders, a man who had once advised her father, stepped forward hesitantly. Princess Amara, the throne is... Amara raised a hand, silencing him. Her voice, when she spoke, was cold and sharp. I am no princess, she said. I am your queen. No one dared to argue. Amara took the throne that had been denied to her. She restructured everything. She allowed women into politics, elevating them beyond their roles as mere wives and mothers. She ordered the execution of any man who tried to oppose her reign. Most of all, she took revenge on those who had belittled women for generations. But power, once tasted, is a hunger that never fades. It was not enough to sit on the throne. She needed to remind them that she was stronger than her father, more ruthless than any king before her. And so, she took multiple husbands, not for love, but for control. In a time she lost a war, one of her husbands was killed, a sacrifice for her kingdom, a display of her power, a reminder that men were disposable. Uzedo feared her. They obeyed her. They worshipped her. But no one loved her. One night, as she sat alone in the grand hall, Ikin entered. He had remained by her side, loyal but distant. He had seen what she had become, and yet he never spoke against her. My queen, he said, kneeling. There is talk among the people. They fear you. She smirked. Good. Ikin hesitated. But they do not respect you. Fear is temporary. Respect is eternal. Her eyes darkened. Are you questioning me? For the first time, he held her gaze. I am reminding you that even the strongest rulers fall when they rule with only their fists. Amara stared at him for a long time before dismissing him, but his words lingered. For years, she had built her kingdom on fear, blood, and control. Yet, deep inside, a question clawed at her. Was this the leader she had fought so hard to become? Or had she simply turned into another version of her father? The thought unsettled her, but she pushed it aside. There was no room for weakness. Not in her kingdom, not in her heart. Amara had built her kingdom with iron and blood. She ruled without mercy, without weakness. And she had made a vow. She would never bear children. She had seen too many women die in childbirth, seen how motherhood weakened them, how it tied them to men who saw them as nothing but vessels. She refused to be like them. Instead, she chose a different path. She would take husbands, not for love, but for control. She would have women bear children in her name, ensuring her bloodline continued. But she would never carry a child herself. She had kept that promise. But fate had a cruel way of testing even the strongest rulers, and her test came in the form of a man named Abina, a different kind of man. Abina was not like the others. He was not a warrior, not a leader, not someone who sought power. He was a simple man, a scholar who had once taught young boys to read, a man who had no interest in war. He was one of the many men she took as husbands of practice. She had started not out of love, but out of dominance. But unlike the others, he did not fear her. One night, Amara walked into the royal garden, seeking solitude. The weight of her crown felt heavier than usual. She had just executed one of her husbands for the kingdom's defeat in battle. And yet, Amara sat there, calm, unbothered. He was reading. She narrowed her eyes. You do not mourn him. Amara looked up, his gaze steady. Mourning changes nothing. His answer irritated her. Men always begged. They begged for life, for power, for favor. But not Amara. She stepped closer. Do you not fear me? I do, he said simply. But fear is not the same as respect. Amara felt something stir inside her, anger, curiosity, something else. She had spent years ruling through terror. She had never stopped to wonder what it meant to be respected. A dangerous feeling. Days passed, weeks. Amara found herself drawn to him. Unlike the other men in her court, he did not fight for her attention. He did not try to please her. He only spoke to her when she spoke to him. But when he did, his words stayed with her long after. For the first time in years, she found herself laughing. Not the cold, mocking laugh she used in court, but a real, unguarded laugh. And that was when she knew she had made a mistake. Love is weakness. One evening, she stood before the mirror, staring at herself, a woman king feared by all. And yet, here she was, thinking about a man. She remembered her father's last words. Love is weakness. She had built her empire by following that rule. She had crushed anyone who dared to make her feel anything other than power. She could not break now. Not for him. And then, the worst happened. A war broke out at the borders. A battle was lost. As tradition demanded, one of her husbands had to die. Her council brought the names before her. And there, written in bold ink, was Amara's. Amara's hands trembled. This was the rule she had set. A leader who did not follow her own rules was weak. A woman king who changed her laws for a man would be seen as a fool. She looked up, and the eyes of her warriors were on her, waiting, expecting. Would she prove she was the ruthless queen they feared, or would she finally break? The choice was hers, and for the first time in her life, Amara did not know what to do. Amara sat on her throne, staring at the name. It should have been easy. She had killed before. She had never faltered. But her hands would not stop shaking. She clenched her fists beneath the table. She could not hesitate. Hesitation was weakness. She had built her kingdom on the corpses of men who had failed her. If she faltered now, she would lose everything. Love is weakness. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Her father, who had ruled with an iron fist. Her father, who had died alone. If you show love, they will turn on you. If you trust, they will betray you. She looked up at the council, her warriors, her people. If she spared Amara, what would they see? A queen who broke her own rules. A woman who let love make her soft. No, she could not allow it. She had to choose power. She had to choose fear, even if it meant killing the only man she had ever cared for. Amara's fate. She rose from her throne, her voice sharp as a blade. Amara shall die at dawn. Gasps echoed through the room, but no one spoke against her. Her warriors nodded, satisfied. The council bowed. The kingdom would remain strong, but inside her, something shattered. She turned sharply and walked away, before anyone could see the storm brewing in her eyes. That night, Amara could not sleep. She paced her chambers, her mind screaming at her. Was this what she had fought for? Had she truly escaped her father's shadow, or had she become him? A queen must never bow to the weakness of love. She pressed her hands against her chest, trying to push away the ache. But it was too late. She had already lost the battle, not to an enemy, but to her own heart. By the time the sun rose, Amara had made her decision. She would not kill Amara, but she could not appear weak before her people. So she did the only thing that could both save him and protect her rule. She would divorce all her husbands. She would end the practice. No more sacrifices. No more needless bloodshed. She stepped into the courtyard, where warriors had already gathered, awaiting the execution. Amara knelt in the dirt, his hands bound. The executioner stood beside him, blade in hand. Amara took a deep breath and raised her voice. The old ways are over, she declared. The murmurs of confusion spread through the crowd. I will no longer sacrifice my men for war. I will no longer take husbands to prove my power. Gasps as shocked whispers. I built this kingdom on blood, but no more. She turned to Amara. His eyes, deep and knowing, held no fear, only understanding. Amara is free. The silence was deafening. But Amara did not waver. She turned her back on the execution grounds, her heart pounding. She had chosen love. She had chosen to be something more than just a ruler of fear. She did not know what came next, but for the first time in her life, she was ready to find out. The courtyard was silent. The air, thick with tension, carried the weight of Amara's words. Amara is free. For years, Her rule had been absolute. Her warriors had followed her without question. The council had obeyed her every command. But now, as she stood before them, everything had changed. Her generals exchanged uneasy glances. The elders whispered among themselves. The executioner, blade in hand, hesitated. And then a voice broke the silence. "Has our queen gone soft?" A tall warrior stepped forward, General Endela, one of her fiercest commanders. His gaze was sharp, questioning. "For years, we have followed you without doubt," he continued. "But now, you speak of love, of sparing men." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Amara lifted her chin, her presence unwavering. "Do you question my rule, Endela?" Her voice was calm, but the threat was clear. Endela hesitated. He had seen what happened to those who opposed her, but he was not alone in his doubt. "If we no longer sacrifice men, how do we punish failure?" Another elder asked. "If we do not kill, how do we show strength?" The question stabbed at Amara, but she had already made her decision. She would not be her father. "Strength is not measured by the bodies we pile on the ground," she declared. "It is measured by the kingdom we build." More whispers, more uncertainty. But then, a single sound cut through the noise. A slow, deliberate clap. Amara turned to Binna. His wrists were still bound, his face bruised, yet he smiled. "A true ruler knows when to change," he said, his voice steady. "And only a fool clings to a broken past." Some scoffed, others nodded in agreement. But the decision had been made. Amara took a dagger from her belt, knelt before Binna, and cut his bindings herself. Gasps echoed. "The old ways are over," she declared once more. Then she turned to her people, unchanged, yet transformed. "This is a new dawn." And for the first time in years, Amara felt something she had long forgotten: hope. The tension in the kingdom grew with each passing day. Though Amara had spoken of change, not everyone was ready for it. Whispers of betrayal slithered through the palace like snakes in the dark. The warriors who once fought for her now questioned her rule. The elders who once swore loyalty now met in secret. And when the strike came, it was swift. The night of the coup, Amara had just retired to her chambers when she heard the clash of steel. The palace was under attack. She rushed to the door, grabbing her sword. Before she could step outside, the doors burst open. Endela stood there, flanked by a dozen warriors, their weapons drawn. "You have ruled long enough, Amara," he said, his voice heavy with anger. She tightened her grip on her sword. "You dare raise a blade against your queen?" she demanded. "No," he answered, "against a woman who has forgotten her duty." And with that, the battle began. The fight was brutal. Amara moved like the warrior she was trained to be, cutting through the traitors with deadly precision. But she was outnumbered. The palace halls ran red with blood as the rebellion spread. Amara's law warriors fought back, but they were too few, too unprepared. And then a blade pierced her side. She gasped, stumbling. The pain was sharp, but what hurt more was the betrayal. She had built this kingdom. She had fought for it. And now, it was turning against her. Abina's choice. Abina fought his way to her, his face pale with fear. "Amara," he caught her before she fell. Blood stained his hands, but he held her firmly. "We have to leave," he urged. But she shook her head. "I will not run. Then you will die." Tears burned in her eyes, not from pain, but from the weight of everything she had lost. She had tried to rule with fear. She had tried to rule with love. And in the end, neither had saved her. Abina made the decision for her. With a swift motion, he lifted her onto a horse. "Forgive me," he whispered, and then he rode away from the burning palace. Days passed. The kingdom of Uzeto was no longer hers. She and Abina had fled deep into the forests, where no worries dared follow. For the first time in her life, Amara was powerless. She sat by the river, staring at her reflection. The fierce queen who once struck fear into the hearts of men was now just a wounded woman, lost and uncertain. Abina sat beside her. "You can still fight," he said softly. She shook her head. "For what?" "For yourself." She turned to him, searching his face. He had never wanted power. He had never wanted the throne. All he had ever wanted was her. And in that moment, she realized she had lost everything. Except him. The end, a new beginning. Amara never returned to the throne. The kingdom of Uzedo fell into chaos without her, torn apart by war and greed. But she did not go back. Instead, she built a new life, away from blood, away from war. And for the first time, she was not just a queen. She was Amara, a woman, a survivor, and finally free.